Hey there folks, Mr. G here with another educational video. This is a follow-up to our previous video on adding and subtracting integers. Now we're going to talk about multiplying and dividing integers. If you forgot, integers are all of our whole numbers that can be positive or negative. We're going to start with multiplying. So if we think about 2 times 3, if we think about the mathematical question 2 times 3, the way you might have understood this is that this multiplication really means groups of. So this is saying 2 groups of 3. So if we have 2 groups of 3, we could imagine drawing this out. We've got 3 over here, 3 over here. 3 plus 3 gives us 6. So another way we could write this out, 2 groups of 3 is the same as 3 plus 3, which gives us a total of 6. Now there's a few things about multiplication that I'd like to go over because they are important. The first thing is that 2 groups of 3 turns out to be the same as 3 groups of 2. Well, we already know 2 groups of 3 is equal to 6. What about 3 groups of 2? Well, we have 2, 2, and 2. So this is 2 plus 2 plus 2. That gives us a total of 6 as well. So one thing that's important with multiplication is whether it's 2 times 3 or 3 times 2, it gives us the same answer. The other thing I'd like to talk about is all the different ways that we can write multiplication. Now, part of the problem with this x as a symbol for multiplication is that sometimes we use x in different places, in particular with algebra. So a lot of times you'll see multiplication written with a dot instead. So instead of writing 2 times 3, we would write 2 dot 3. And this just means the same thing. You might also see 2 in brackets and 3 in brackets like this. This also means multiplication. You could also just have 1 in brackets and then the other out front. All of these things mean multiplication. All of these things mean the exact same thing. Personally, I really like this one with the dot. Now, what happens when we want to multiply or divide with negatives? So what if we had a question like 2 times negative 3? Well, fortunately, this multiplication here, we're not drawing the symbol, but this does mean multiply. We can think of this as 2 groups of negative 3. So if we drew that out, we got 3 negatives and then another 3 negatives, so we have a total of 6 negatives. In other words, this is like minus 3, which is the same as negative 6. What happens at the negatives first? If we think of the multiplication again as saying negative 2 groups of 3, how do you have negative 2 groups of something? That seems a little bit weird. But fortunately, we remember that the order for multiplication, we're allowed to swap around. So we're allowed to say 2 times 3 is the same as 3 times 2. Well, it's the same with negatives. We just got to make sure that the negative stays with the 2. So this is the same as 3 times negative 2. So we can understand this as 3 groups of negative 2, which makes a lot more sense. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 negatives. So again, we get an answer of negative 6. What about negative 2 times negative 3? So now we have negative 2 groups of negative 3. That seems really weird, and unfortunately we can't use the trick we used last time because both of them are negative. So no matter which one's first, it's still kind of hard to understand. Now, as it turns out, this is going to give us positive 6. The 6 comes from 3 times 2, and the positive comes from a negative times a negative. Why is a negative times a negative equal to a positive? We're going to get to that in our next video a little bit, and I'll post links to other videos that do a really great job of explaining this, but we do need a little bit more before we can fully understand this. Now you'll notice for all of our examples here, it was always 2 times 3, and in all of the cases our answer was something to do with 6, either positive 6 or negative 6. So when we're multiplying, the key is that the two numbers tell us what number we're going to get, but then the signs, whether they're positive or negative, tell us if our answer is positive or negative. If we look at our pattern, when we have 2 positives, our answer is positive, and if we have 2 negatives, our answer is positive. If one of them is negative, like in the blue or the red, then our answer is negative. Let's write that down. So to summarize, if the signs match, our answer is going to be positive. So if we have a positive number times another positive number, our answer is positive. Negative times a negative, our answer is also positive. So as long as they match, our answer is positive. If our signs are opposite, so if we have negative times positive or positive times negative, then our answer is negative, not positive. Now this turns out to be true whether we're multiplying or dividing. So if we had a negative divided by a positive divided by a negative, our answers would be negative. Same thing is true if we have a positive divided by a positive or a negative divided by a negative. Once we know the sign of our answer, whether it's positive or negative, we can just kind of ignore the signs in the question and just do the multiplication or the division with the numbers. So for example, if we had 7 times negative 4, first off, we want to figure out the sign of our answer. Well, we've got a positive times a negative, which tells us that our answer is going to be negative. Once we know that, we are just going to try and figure out what 7 times 4 is. And if you remember your times tables, 7 times 4, that's 28. So our answer would be negative 28. Now I said that the rules were the same for dividing. I'd like to show you why that is. First off, if we have a question like 8 divided by 4, so we have 8 pieces split into 4 groups, and then we want to know how many are in each group. So if these are our 8 pieces, we can see that if we split them up like this, each of our 4 groups contains 2 pieces, so our answer is 2. And notice, each of these pieces is positive because we had a total at the start of positive 8, so each of the group has positive 2 pieces in it. If we look at a slightly different example, now we're starting with negative 8 pieces and still splitting it into 4 groups. Notice that when we split it into 4 groups now, each group doesn't have positive 2 pieces in it, each group has negative 2 pieces in it. As we can see, when our signs match here, we end up with a positive answer, but when our signs are different, we'll end up with a negative answer. Now the last 2 examples with our signs here are a little bit harder to explain with a picture like this, because it's hard to think about splitting 8 pieces into negative 4 groups or negative 8 pieces into negative 4 groups. And for the same reason that it's hard to understand how you could have negative 2 groups of negative 3, I will instead include links to videos after our next lesson that go into a little bit about why this happens. But for now, we can use our rule. Notice that the top and the bottom have a different sign, so we know our answer will be negative. 8 divided by 4 is equal to 2. Here our sign is the same, so our answer is going to be positive. 8 divided by 4 is equal to 2. Now, if we're dealing with a division question like this with really big numbers, or a multiplication question with really big numbers as well, you might be tempted to use your calculator, but you have to be careful. The calculators that you'll have access to, the basic ones, don't really deal with negatives very well. My advice to you is to use the strategies that we used in our simpler questions. So instead of relying on the calculator to figure out the plus or the minus sign, we'll instead say, okay, it's a negative divided by a negative. Since the signs match, we know our answer would be positive. And then when I plug into my calculator, I'm going to plug into my calculator 256 divided by 8. So this is the part that would go into your calculator. We're not going to put any negative signs because the calculator sometimes spits out the wrong answer. The reason why this happens is a lot of calculators have the negative sign as well as the minus sign as the same button. So it gets confused if you want to divide or if you want to subtract. Basically, the calculator isn't really great at dealing with negative numbers, so let's deal with the negatives and just have the calculator deal with the big numbers. So when we plug in 256 divided by 8, we'll get the answer of 32. And we know that our answer is positive, so we know our answer is positive 32. Let's do a quick check of your understanding. 2 questions on the screen. Pause the video right now, grab a piece of paper, and see if you can solve them on your own. Then we'll go over the answers together. Okay, let's go over the answers. For our first one here, negative 2 times what number will give us 24? So similar to the ones where we were doing adding and subtracting, we have to think backwards here. First thing we want to think about is 2 times what number would give us 24. In other words, 24 divided by 2 is what? Well, we'd have to put a 12 here, right? 2 times 12 gives us 24. Now we have to worry a little bit about the sign. We know that our answer is going to be positive. We've got a negative here. So what needs to go here in order to give us a positive at the end? We're going to need another negative. So the thing that should go into our blank here is negative 12. Negative 2 times negative 12 gives us positive 24. For our second question here, we don't have to do any backwards thinking. We're just dividing. So if you remember, the strategy that I said was to first take care of the sign. We have a positive divided by a negative. That tells us that our answer is going to be negative, right? These don't match. The signs don't match. Once we've taken care of the sign, now we can just figure out the division. You could use your calculator for this. You could plug in 18 divided by 3 into your calculator. Or if you know that your division and times tables, you'll know that 18 divided by 3 gives us 6. So our answer would be negative 6. This is the end of our second video on integers. Tune into tomorrow's videos where we start going over some more complicated adding and subtracting questions, as well as throwing in some order of operations. See you then.